Today is Tuesday, August 4th, 2026, and today is National Chocolate Chip Cookie Day. And honestly, that's a pretty strong entry on the calendar. Because a chocolate chip cookie is one of those rare things that works almost any way you make it. Warm and soft, crispy around the edges, slightly underbaked in the middle while everyone argues whether it is actually finished. And if you are the person who says, "I only want one," then somehow keeps breaking off little pieces until 3 cookies have disappeared, I know what happened. But cookies are a good reminder that sometimes the simplest things become the things we remember most, which actually fits August 4th better than I expected, because today we are looking at a few things that started much smaller than the way we know them now. First, we'll see how 10 small ships created the beginning of the Coast Guard. Then we'll look at the first Billboard Hot 100 and the moment music popularity became something people could measure. And finally, we'll separate the legend from the reality behind one of the most famous champagne stories ever told. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone who keeps finding historical stories that sound completely fake until you realize they actually happened. When most people think about the Coast Guard, they probably picture rescues, storms, helicopters, ships battling rough seas. But the beginning of the Coast Guard was not about saving people from hurricanes or searching for boats in trouble. It started with something much more practical: money. On August 4th, 1790, President George Washington signed legislation creating 10 revenue cutters. Their job was simple: protect the new country's revenue. At the time, one of the biggest sources of money for the young United States government was tariffs, taxes placed on imported goods. But collecting those taxes was not easy. Merchants could avoid paying duties. Cargo could disappear before reaching officials. Smuggling was a real threat to a government that was still trying to prove it could function. So the solution was not a massive government agency. It was 10 small ships. Those cutters patrolled American waters, enforced trade laws, and helped make sure the government actually received the money it was owed. And that is the part I find fascinating. One of America's oldest maritime services did not begin with a dramatic rescue. It began with paperwork. A new country needed revenue. People were avoiding the rules. So the government sent ships after them. Over time, those revenue cutters became what we recognize today as the modern United States Coast Guard. The mission expanded: saving lives, protecting waterways, responding to disasters, serving during wartime. But the beginning was surprisingly ordinary. A young government had a problem. It found a practical solution. And that solution grew into something much bigger than anyone in 1790 could have imagined. From ships protecting government revenue, August 4th moves to something completely different. A system created to measure what people could not stop listening to. On August 4th, 1958, Billboard introduced the Hot 100. Today, the chart feels like it has always existed. A song reaches number 1. An artist breaks a record. Fans argue about who deserves the top spot. But before the top 100, there was no single list that combined the many ways people consume music. Radio play, record sales, jukebox popularity. The music industry had plenty of information. It just needed a way to organize it. The first number 1 song on the Billboard Hot 100 was Ricky Nelson's "Poor Little Fool." But the biggest story was not just the song. It was the idea behind the chart. The Hot 100 turned popularity into something visible. It gave people a way to answer a simple question: what is everyone listening to? And once that question had an answer, music changed. Artists could chase number 1 hits. Fans could debate rankings. A song was no longer just something you heard. It became a cultural moment. That's why charts matter. They do not just tell us what was popular. They tell us what people were experiencing together. A song playing in someone's car. A song heard through a bedroom wall. A song everyone somehow knew even if they claimed they hated it. The technology changed over time. Records became cassettes. Cassettes became CDs. CDs became downloads. Downloads became streaming. But the basic idea stayed the same. People wanted to know what everyone else was listening to. And on August 4th, 1958, Billboard created the scoreboard that would help answer that question. And once something becomes famous, the story surrounding it can sometimes become just as powerful as the truth. That brings us to one of the most famous stories in the world of wine. A story about a monk, a discovery, and a sentence so perfect that people have repeated it for generations. The story goes that on August 4th, 1693, a Benedictine monk named Dom Pérignon discovered champagne. And after tasting the bubbles for the first time, he supposedly called out, "Come quickly, I am drinking the stars." It is a fantastic line. It sounds exactly like something the person who created champagne should have said. The problem is, it probably didn't happen that way. Dom Pérignon did not simply invent champagne in one magical moment, and that famous quote appears to be more legend than documented history. But the truth is still interesting, because removing the myth does not make Dom Pérignon less important. He really was an important figure in the history of wine. Working at the Abbey of Hautevillers in France's Champagne region, he helped improve winemaking techniques, especially blending and quality control. He was part of a much longer process that eventually created the champagne people recognize today. And honestly, that version is more interesting. Because most inventions do not happen in one perfect moment. They happen through experimentation, mistakes, improvements, people solving one problem then another. The legend says one man discovered the stars. The reality says many people spent generations figuring out how to make a product that could survive fermentation, pressure, transportation, and time. The legend is cleaner, but the real story is more human. And that may be why the legend survived, because people love a perfect origin story. We like the idea that one person had one brilliant moment that changed everything. But history is usually messier than that. And sometimes the messy version is the one worth remembering. Because this episode has been full of things that became bigger than where they started. 10 small ships became the Coast Guard. A chart became the scoreboard for popular music. And a complicated winemaking process became attached to a story about drinking stars. And maybe that is why this next person came to mind. Because people work the same way. The labels we give someone rarely tell the whole story. Actor, writer, director, musician. Those words are accurate, but they are not the entire person. And it just so happens that he was born on this day. Today, we are talking about the one and only Billy Bob Thornton, born on August 4th, 1955. Thornton's career is interesting because it never followed a simple path. He was not someone who arrived in Hollywood as an obvious leading man. He spent years working through smaller roles, writing and developing a style that was very much his own. Then came Sling Blade, a film he wrote, directed, and starred in. The movie introduced audiences to one of the things Thornton does best, creating characters who feel completely real, even when they are unusual. His characters are often complicated, sometimes funny, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes damaged, but almost always memorable. And that may be the biggest thread running through his career. Thornton has never seemed interested in playing roles who fit neatly into a category. He has played heroes, villains, outsiders, ordinary people placed in extraordinary situations. He has moved between film, television, and music without ever feeling like he belonged to only one world. And that's why he fits today's theme, because a label can tell you what someone does. It cannot always tell you who they are. The Coast Guard was not just 10 ships. The Hot 100 was not just a chart. Champagne was not just a bottle. And Billy Bob Thornton is not just an actor. The interesting part is everything underneath. The unexpected choices, the unusual characters, the stories that do not fit neatly into a summary. Anyway, the more I work through history, the more I realize that the simple version is usually only the beginning. A name gives us a starting point. A reputation gives us an image, but the real story comes from the details that do not fit perfectly. And that reminds me of something Billy Bob Thornton said. If you want anybody to have a different voice, you have to visualize and hear the voices of all these people. If you'd like to hear more of my work, narration, podcasts, or other projects, you can find it all at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and thanks for wandering through history with me for a while. I'll see you tomorrow.